Hi, I'm Rosalie Ginevra, the Executive Director of the Architectural League, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this conversation from Stud to Stalled, Queer Space 1996 to 2016 between Joel Sanders and Mario Gooden. Today, June 28th, is the 52nd anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, the 1969 event that set in motion the modern history of the fight for LGBTQ rights. So a very resonant day for this program. In 1996, Joel Sanders published Stud, Architectures of Masculinity, in which he examined the ways in which architecture responds to and constructs ideas of masculinity. One very significant part of the struggle for LGBTQ rights over the last decades has been the evolution of an expanded sense of inclusion within and beyond what was understood at the time of Stonewall as broadly the gay community, an evolving understanding that the lived spectrum of sexual identity includes transgender, bisexual, and other orientations. And identity itself is understood now as intersectional. As Joel said in an interview with Architectural Review last year, the evolution of my own thinking mirrors changes in the academic and design community, as well as the culture at large. We now recognize that identities are shaped by the complex intersections of age, gender, race, class, and disability. In the new edition of Stud, issued this year on the 25th anniversary of the original publication, Joel has included a new introduction that discusses his own opening and growth beyond the perspective of a white gay man to an understanding of a much more inclusive characterization of non-compliant bodies, that is, bodies and abilities that do not conform to dominant cultural norms. A significant driver of that evolution has been his work with the transgender theorist Susan Stryker and law professor Terry Kogan on the project Stalled, which took as its point of departure national debates surrounding transgender access to public restrooms to address an urgent social justice issue, the need to create safe, sustainable, and inclusive public restrooms for everyone, regardless of age, gender, race, religion, and disability. That effort led to the creation of Mixed Design, a think tank and design consultancy that works to understand and address the spatial needs of constituencies that traditional approaches to architecture and interior design overlook. Among other projects, the now dual practice Joel Sanders Architects Mixed Design is currently working on a wide-ranging project on inclusive museums to reimagine the experience of visiting a museum to make it an attractive and comfortable activity for all. In addition to Stud, Joel's the editor of Joel Sanders Writings and Projects, and with the late Diana Balmori, of Groundwork Between Landscape and Architecture. He's a professor at the Yale School of Architecture. Joel's partner in today's conversation, and in many conversations over the years, is Mario Gooden. Mario is founding principal of Huff and Gooden Architects, professor of practice at Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, where he's also co-director of the Global Africa Lab, and an extremely active lecturer, critic, and visiting professor of architecture, including serving as the 2021 Portman Prize Studio Critic at the Georgia Tech School of Architecture. Among, many other appointments and honors, Mario is a research associate at the Visual Identities in Art and Design Institute at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and was the recipient of a 2019 American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Architecture. His multimedia installation, The Refusal of Space, was recently exhibited in Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America at the Museum of Modern Art. Current projects at Huff and Gooden include the Dr. Carter G. Woodson Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, and the Clinton Church Restoration Project in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which will interpret the life and legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois. Mario is also author of the probing and seminal work, Dark Space, Architecture, Representation, Black Identity, a collection of histories, meditations, and speculations on the idea and meaning of Blackness in architecture, published in 2016 by Columbia Books on Architecture in the City. Today's conversation will be followed by a chance for questions from the audience. We ask that you use the Q&A function on Zoom to submit your questions. And now I'm very happy to turn the program over to Mario and Joel.
Thanks, Rosalie, for that introduction. Joel, are you there?
Yeah, I am, but it says when unable to start video because the host has stopped it. Hold on, let's see. Ah, got it. Good,
Ah,
thank you.
there you are. Great.
Okay, sorry, sorry.
All right, great. We really have a lot that we want to discuss today, Joel. So I think we'll just jump right into it. And I'm curious. After reading the new preface, why a personal memoir directed at a younger generation? The 25th anniversary edition of Stud begins with this new preface, which is different in tone from your previous essays. It's a personal memoir that describes the genesis of Stud, your coming out as a gay man while an assistant professor at the Princeton School of Architecture during the AIDS crisis in the early 1990s. Why did you choose this format of a personal memoir?
Well, Mario, I chose a kind of personal narrative because I wanted it to be addressed to, or the new republication of Stud, which is a kind of historical document to be addressed to a younger generation of designers, but also scholars who are interested in the evolution of queer space. And the idea of the republication and the new preface was to two purposes. First, I think of it as a historical document. Over the past 5, 8 years, I've been receiving inquiries from young architectural historians, actually from all over the world, even who are mapping the emergence of what was then a new field of inquiry in the mid 1990s, again, queer space. But second, as Rosalie said in her generous introduction, the idea of the preface is to map the evolution of my own thinking about queer space. Why should you be interested in my evolution? Because I think it mirrors the impact of shifting conceptions of gender on our community, on the design community, but also the culture at large. And also just want to say that this idea of the value of history, that if we want to move forward, we have to look back. That's the kind of idea I think that shapes Stud, but most importantly, shapes why I consented in the first place to have the book republished 25 years later.
Yeah, this new preface begins with its origin story, the genesis. And in describing the genesis of the book, you describe how your exposure to queer theory and queer activist art, along with the death of John Ponzi, one of your best friends, led to wanting to do something to make a contribution to queer activism. Can you talk about this genesis story a little bit?
Yeah. Again, uh, what I was trying to convey is this idea that Stud, like other aspects of my practice, and I know Mario, your practice and the work of people we admire, is often shaped by the convergence of what I would say are personal, professional, and political forces. So in this case, as you already said, I was a young assistant professor at Princeton back in 1996. I had recently come out as a gay man, and as you said, one of my closest friends had been diagnosed with AIDS. That was before, antiviral drug treatments. Uh, HIV was a death sentence. And so I, like many gay men of this era, was consumed by this kind of sense of grief, but also rage, directed against the Reagan administration, who had turned a blind eye to the epidemic. And so I thought, what can I do to make a difference? So I thought, let me think about what I know best, architecture. And I looked around to the work of the trends of the time. It was really deconstructivist architecture. I admire that movement, but it left me. It, it didn't resonate with me. Why? Although formally inventive, it seemed out of touch with a lot of the social and political realities of that time. I was inspired by the work of feminist scholars like Beatrice Colomina, my teacher, former teacher Mary McLeod, Dolores Hayden, as well as the work of a new generation at that time of queer curators and scholars like Mark Robbins, whose work is represented in STUD. However, I found the queer inspiration that I was looking for outside of the discipline of architecture. And it was really two interrelated movements or tendencies and networks of people, queer theorists and queer activists, that really drove STUD. And it was largely, there were two very close friends, John Lindell, artist and architect, and Diana Fuss, a theorist and professor at Princeton. And they were my sort of gay intellectual mentors, and they introduced me to the network of queer theorists and historians like Lee Edelman, George Chauncey, D.A. Miller, Marcia Ian in the book, artists who question gender norms, some of them gay, some not, like Bob Gober, Matthew Barney, Felix Gonzalez-Torres, who had just died at that time. And maybe most significantly, the designers of the book. They were Marlene and McCarty and Donald Moffat of a firm called Bureau. They were an outgrowth of, they were part of an outgrowth of ACT UP, the activist collective, and part of now what is a legendary collective that has been represented in international exhibitions called Grand Fury. So the thing that makes me most proud is the design of that book by those amazing people. And Mario, I know, like mine, your practice is also committed to integrating the built environment, through an intersectional Black lens. And I also know from our many conversations over the years that you didn't necessarily find the educational or professional environment you were surrounded with particularly supportive as a queer Black architect. So what about, how did you negotiate this, let's say, unsupportive era?
Yeah, I think similarly for me, it was as well through art, but really probably as part of my, I would say, postgraduate curriculum. My graduate school curriculum, at the time in the late 80s, early 80s, was really built around a pedagogy of critical and cultural theory, literary theory, as well as contemporary art. But most of those writings were by white men, and most of the art that we looked at was by white men. If there was any feminist writings, in the curriculum, it was really limited to seminars. So upon graduation from Columbia, which I attended, similar to you, as a young teacher and a young architect, I had come across the work of Black feminist theorist Bell Hooks, and that really, I think, began the sort of genesis of the practice as it is today, as well as I was quite interested in the work of artists and performers like Bill T. Jones and Arnie Zane. Arnie Zane, who as well died of AIDS, but I was very interested in their work, the work of their dance company, and so it was. And I should also add into the mix the Black queer science fiction writer Samuel Delany, whose work I just devoured as a young architect. But for me, that was starting outside of architecture, I guess similar to you, and then finding a way in which that would inform my practice. So I'm wondering, Joel, also in the book's new preface, you offer a present-day self-critical assessment of what you perceive as the book's strengths and limitations. I'm wondering if we could discuss what themes you consider to still be relevant for a contemporary audience and those which require rethinking. Let's begin by interrogating the building types, methodology which shapes the work being done by your inclusive design consultancy, Mixed Design.
Yeah, well, Mario, thanks. Again, I think the kind of principle, the organizing principle of STUD that I still think is relevant. I know for me, and I hope for other, for a contemporary audience, is this kind of idea of the necessity of interrogating the normative standards and conventions of practice, including building types. And so, the book is organized into 5 chapters, and it brings together essays and projects by writers, architects, and artists, and that considers how the design of an everyday space like the home, the office, the bathroom, gym, the park, uh, facilitate what queer theorist Judith Butler described as the performance of identity. And, um, and this was again based on Butler's, incredibly influential idea that this idea that gender identity, human identity, but gender identity in particular, masculinity and femininity are not innate, inborn biological traits, but they're culturally constructed learned modes of behavior, and that they rely on sort of different disciplines and discourses, including the architecture, to sort of shape our identities. And so what that led me to was to kind of rethink in a certain way how I was taught to think about architecture back then, which was really to kind of maybe focus on the kind of photogenic object building, and instead to kind of consider, I would say, the dynamic interplay between 2 terms that are both cultural constructions, and that is the body as a cultural construction and the designed environment as one. And we were kind of influenced by this kind of idea of the metaphor of architecture or the built environment behaving like a stage that allows costumed actors to perform their various roles.
Yeah, the piece you co-wrote with John Lindell about the Air Force Academy, designed by SOM, exemplifies this idea. And I came to realize that the clothing that clads the bodies behave like the claddings, through reading your work. And I'm wondering if you might sort of talk about this project and your analysis of it.
Yeah, So the Air Force Academy, which is a mid-century, kind of icon, at least it was for John Lindell and I. And in preparation for kind of writing this piece in the book, we flew to Palm Springs, where John was mortified to learn that I did have a driver's license and still don't. But anyway, so we finally got there to the academy. We toured it, and we also mined the archives and found the original photos in the book. Um, and it's interesting because when the building, but because we found ourselves in this love-hate relationship with the building, okay, which employs, the characteristic modernist geometric grid. And again, the grid was interesting for us as a kind of emblem of the kind of modernist masculine mind. Even the idea of that rationality and geometry are kind of male intellectual prerogative. And as you can see in these images, the grid informs the disposition of the composition at all scales, from the orthogonal buildings and how they're laid out, the structure and fenestration of the buildings. But we were most fascinated by the interiors and the furnishings and the clothing, right? And we're interested in the way that the grid not only informs the disposition of the buildings, but ultimately the flow and interaction and disposition of bodies in space. And so, for example, there's that image I think you showed of the cadets were literally taught to walk and march and follow the gridded paving plaza there. Or again, these sort of symmetrical closets where they hang their uniforms and rifles. And we were understood that they were actually taught to hang them in a very precise way. They were inspected every morning to make sure that those, let's say, costumes, implements, in other words, fashion, architecture, and equipment, fashions, in this case, a male military identity, and it's engineered in part at least through the manufacturing of the design of the built environment. And I just say that, you know, this notion to what we said before is I still am committed, you know, to interrogating architectural types through a historical lens in order to not reproduce them, but call them into question and posit alternative ways of distributing bodies in space.
Yeah, you also write, you know, in the new preface, hindsight is 2020. So, and looking back now allows you to examine the book's strengths and limitations. You know, for a number of people like myself, and you and I have discussed this sort of personally as well, you know, who were young gay designers and architects in the 1990s, Stud was a very important book for its provocation, its insight, and its critique. Yet the critique of heteronormative masculinity in Stud was not only limited by the binary that you describe in terms of masculine versus feminine, but also by being limited, if you will, to the white male bodies exemplified by this image of the cadets, and the notions about white masculinity as being a default condition, if you will, in terms of architectural subjectivity. I mean, and this, you know, seems to be a paradox in spite of the fact that many of the pioneers of, you know, the queer liberation movement, you know, were people like Sylvia Rivera, Marshall P. Johnson, and Stormy DeLavery. You know, additionally, you know, the AIDS epidemic really disproportionately affected African Americans and Blacks in New York, perhaps more than any other demographic. So I found this image, which is by Martin Fink, you know, in Stud, you know, taken outside of Badlands in 1979, really interesting in the ways in which it talks about how architecture not only constructs masculinity, but it constructs whiteness, if you will, and white masculinity. So I'm just wondering if we could maybe just kind of talk about this image a little bit as it pertains, if you will, to the limitations of the book.
Well, you know, before answering the question, I just want to affirm, Mario, what you're saying, which is something I also state in the preface, that, you know, looking back, I realize how Stud as a whole, you know, reflects my own experience as a gay male architect, you know, during the AIDS crisis, but also I think mirrors the kind of, for the most part, limitations of the activist perspective as well. And, you know, now, Mara, you point out that now we're kind of rehabilitating, you know, what was an overlooked history of those important trans and Black activists. But at that time, it wasn't central to the discourse. And, you know, again, I belatedly I regret the exclusive, almost exclusive focus, except maybe for this image and a few other projects that, you know, focus on the white able-bodied gay male experience to the exclusion of others. But Mary, maybe you want to start. What's your feeling about this image, which I think we both admire?
Yeah, I find this image really quite fascinating. One, you know, for a number of reasons. One, you know, in terms of the construction of masculinity, you know, the figures in the foreground, the men in the foreground, you know, in the plaid shirts, the, you know, cowboy boots, work boots, you know, dungarees, you know, so a kind of hyper masculinity, if you will, you know, and hyper, you know, ruggedness. But then in the background, you know, these two young Black men who are, you know, by their dressed to defy perhaps what were the stereotypes, or what one would think of as being the stereotypical fashion of Black men in 1979, and that these two guys, you know, they're wearing khakis, they're wearing pullover sweaters or jacket button-down shirts, so they are, you know, in some way it seems, you know, more well dressed then the figures in the foreground as a kind of defying a certain stereotype or expectation, if you will, maybe defying an expectation, but also, you know, the kind of preppiness of their look is also a nod to an idea about whiteness, I think. And, you know, so yes, this is the only figure in the book that includes men of color, but this image is still fundamentally about whiteness, it seems.
But I don't know if you'd agree, but I also think it speaks to the way in which, you know, queer folk sort of appropriate, you know, again, stereotypical images, but maybe take them to extremes. And often those are images of masculinity that are maybe simultaneously oppressive as well as objects of desire. And in this case, like I think the white men on the left, right? I mean, where are we? We're in the meatpacking district, which really was the meatpacking district, this kind of butch place, right? Where real men did real work. Okay, and then here are these gay men, you know, sort of almost dressed up in these hyper articulated examples of white rugged masculinity. And I don't know if you'd agree, but I think as you point out, the black men, of course, framed in the background, and I think that's interesting too in this image, you know, are again dressed in the garb of like white elite preppies. So it's very complicated appropriation of fashion and architecture to construct identity.
Yeah, and I'd like to, you know, maybe pivot a little bit to sort of talk about how moving from stud to the work of your practice mixed design and your overall project called Stalled, and this talk is, you know, our conversation is called From Stud to Stalled, you know, how that work of mixed design seeks to construct a new or more, let's say a more inclusive way of thinking about the design of space. And so I'm wondering if you might maybe talk a little bit about, you know, the work of mixed design.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. And again, you know, I while I, you know, accept accountability for the limitations of stud that you point out, I'd like to think that my colleagues and I in mixed design, you know, our inclusive design consultancy is trying to kind of move beyond that, and we've adopted again this more inclusive intersectional approach. And I would also kind of want to point out that, you know, this theme, I think, of today's talk between us is how we've both been inspired by looking outside the discipline. And so if the early work like Stud was based in queer theory, a lot of this work was really influenced by my colleague, Susan Stryker, who Rosalie mentioned at the beginning, you know, an important trans scholar, historian and activist. And it was she who said, hey, Sanders, you know, you gotta get with the program here and become more familiar with the work of not only transgender studies, but in particular disability studies, and also ultimately, you know, the work of critical race studies. And so the work now that we're doing is trying to, again, is based on this intersectional approach, which argues that human experience and embodied identity is complicated, right? And it's that we're all constituted by a variety of interconnected factors that includes, but aren't limited to, like age, gender, race, culture, religion, ability, and income, and wealth. And so, Mario, you mentioned, you know, Mix is working on a series of initiatives. We interrogate different building types, and you know, we began with the bathroom. And, you know, I think that it kind of illustrates our process, which is first to begin through this critical interrogation of the normative conventions. In this case, challenging what seemed to be the inevitability in these kind of bathroom culture wars that we were responding to in 2015, this seeming inevitability of a type we take for granted, the traditional sex-segregated restroom, that's even mandated by building codes. And again, you know, Susan and I and others would argue that by sorting human beings into two rooms based on the idea that there are only two sexes, men and women, just perpetuates this foundational problematic binary that is foundational and problematic to our culture. So what we try to do, as illustrated here, is come up with an alternative type. We call it the multi-user facility. We call ourselves binary abolitionists, okay? It eliminates those two spaces and it creates one interactive space with that's porous extension of the corridor and allows everyone to sort of mix, or most everyone to mix in shared communal washing and grooming facilities. And then privacy is introduced into the stalls in the back. And also, you know, we're also thinking about this now, and this is an image of some airport prototypes we're working on. We're working with a lot of other universities and clients to install these. But I do want to say what I'm most proud of, more than the designs we made, is the work that team member Terry Kogan did. He formed an alliance with the AIA and the National Center for Transgender Equality. And he managed to amend the International Plumbing Code, the model plumbing code that shapes regulations across our country. And now in the new code that was just released, this sort of desegregated type is available for all of you out there if you're interested to implement in your project. So, you know, now I want to kind of turn a question back to you, Mari. You were kind enough to get me out of the doghouse and suggest that perhaps we were trying to transcend those earlier limitations through intersectionality. I know that that is a way of thinking that also informs your work. So how does it?
Well, you know, I think it's really important to, you know, to say or to state that, you know, and I think this, you know, I'm now just kind of thinking about this overlap between your work with Terry Kogan, and, you know, the genesis of intersectionality. That, you know, the word was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a law professor, you know, at Columbia. But it was coined, you know, as far back as 1989, and Dr. Crenshaw coined the term to describe bias and violence against Black women. So its origins is rooted in a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, anti-racist politics, and law, really. So it, you know, it comes back to, you know, to law as actually critical race theory, you know, which has now become this kind of hot button issue, which I don't think many people realize and understand what critical race theory is, but it was really based in a kind of understanding about power structures, where power comes from and how it collides, how it intersects, and how it interlocks. So for me, you know, the answer to that question that you were just asking, you know, is yes. I mean, in my writing and in my work, I'm very much interested in questions about intersectionality, because I'm interested fundamentally in the relationships between architecture and power. And additionally, you know, I mentioned bell hooks previously in terms of informing my work as a, you know, as a young teacher and as a young architect, and more recently, my work being informed by Black feminist theorists such as Tina Camp, Saidiya Hartman, and Black feminist writers such as Dion Brand and you know, and others, you know, who are sort of Christina Sharp, sorry, who are really kind of looking at these questions. But I also want to say that I think it's simply, you know, because we've been discussing this, you know, offline a bit in terms of, you know, the overlaps, you know, as intersectionality is defined today in terms of race or gender or LGBT sort of issues. And as Dr. Crenshaw says, you know, it's not simply that there's a race problem here or a gender problem there or a class problem there or an LGBT problem there, because many of these frameworks erase what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. So I think fundamentally, again, it comes back to this relationship of these relationships of power, and understanding architecture as spatializing those relationships.
Right, right. Mario, first of all, I want to thank you recently for encouraging me to kind of going back to the source, what you mentioned, critical race studies that goes back to the 80s at least. And as you say, the foundational work was done by Crenshaw, right? A Black feminist legal scholar, right? So to see those origins really lie in critical race theory itself, and an issue that informs both our work. And one of the things that strikes me is this idea of intersectionality is actually a pretty old concept, one that we weren't as aware of as that we should be. But what strikes me is, again, getting back to this theme that you talk about, power, which is so, I think, important to all of our work, and again brings us back to this imperative that I think was foundational to Stud, and I know is, I think, still foundational to both our work, which is this need again to kind of look back in a critical way and look at the complicity and accountability of our disciplines, in this case the design disciplines, in perpetuating structural racism, heteronormativity, and ableism, right? And to look at how that takes place in the protocols of professional practice that each of us, take for granted, sleepwalk our way through, accept as doctrine, as based in function, when they're really, 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 really often based upon the most deeply rooted and problematic ingrained cultural assumptions, again, about what constitutes a normal versus a kind of abnormal body. So I think that was foundational to the work like Crenshaw. I think it was foundational to Stud, and I know it's very foundational to the work that you and your colleagues are doing today.
So I'm not sure where we are on time, Joe, but maybe this might be a good moment to open it up in terms of the Q&A, and if anyone would like to put in questions into the Q&A, and we'll stop sharing here.
Okay.
And then we can maybe have a little bit of a discussion about some of these, some of the questions. So let's see here. All right, so we do have a question from Casey Jones, a friend of ours. And Casey, hi Casey. Casey's question is, Stud, along with Jennifer Bloomer and Beatrice Colomina's Sexuality in Space, are of the same time frame, were revelatory publications for me in the activist 90s. Do you think architecture and activism are as closely connected today?
Mario, I'm going to let you answer that first, but I want to thank Casey because I think it was Casey who really, I think we had met before, but it was when we were both part of the First Impressions program, right? That was Casey.
That's right.
That we met through the GSA and became friends. We were competitors and we became friends.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Anyway, go ahead.
Well, to answer that question, I certainly think that architecture and activism are perhaps more closely connected at this moment, given, let's say, our last 4 years, and particularly over the last year and a half. And I can think of Design as Protest, for example. Dark Matter University, Black in Design. So particularly in terms of social justice and architecture, and also climate and architecture, there is amongst the younger generation, a keen desire, to I would say dismantle some of the systemic some of the structures of architecture that have contributed to inequities and that are, that are damaging the planet.
And I would also say that, I do think that one of the silver linings is a bad way of putting it, of this period of uncertainty that we've been in, engendered by, the pandemic in conjunction with Black Lives Matter, I think has actually reinforced, a tendency, which I know I've seen, particularly amongst my students at Yale, and also a younger generation of activists who've really been, I think, trying to interrogate, again, architecture's role and potential to ameliorate the kind of social, political, economic, and environmental crises that we're living in. And so I'm personally, encouraged.
So let's see, here is another question. This one was added in the chat. Oh, this is another friend and colleague. This is from Mark Robbins. Glad to hear the discussion. How do you think younger scholars and designers are drawing from earlier work then known as queer space? And Joe, I'll let you start that one first.
Okay, I was going to ask you to start that one, but first of all, hi, Mark. Okay, Mark was, again, one of the partners in crime. He was so important, or you were, if you're there, I can't see your face, in being a part of STUD and making it happen. And, but I think that to answer your question, I mentioned it before, I've been fascinated how so many younger scholars and designers and architects, have reached out. And I think they're really, again, trying to kind of mine what could potentially be a forgotten moment in our history, or let's say the history of let's say, queer space, and trying to document it, but also gain inspiration from it. Like one thing that comes to mind, I never saw it, but the last architectural biennale, I think there was something called the Cruising Pavilion that I heard was amazing. That again, I think was a kind of younger generation, and again, trying to appropriate and maybe gain inspiration and tweak and transform, this idea of cruising, which I'm old enough as a senior citizen say was an important part of the role that the physical design environment played in forming gay communities. But Mario, what about you? What do you think?
I think there are, and I think I can think of a number of younger scholars who are, in fact, if you will, mining the archive of your work, Joel, and of Mark's work, and are interested in, in how to think about, or how to, take your methods, if you will, and apply them to thinking about queer space as related to dismantling the binaries of masculine and feminine in architectural history and in architectural research. And so that is part of the conversation. I think that is happening simultaneously to to what's happening relative to critical race studies and to thinking about the climate. When I was a student at Columbia, there was not a queer student association. There is now, and I think amongst architecture schools that I know of, there are, students have formed, collaboratives, have formed sort of collectives, to do this kind of work and to ask these kinds of questions.
And Mario, also to reinforce what you're saying, I too have been heartened by also, like at Yale and other schools of architecture, seeing the emergence of these sort of grassroots student organizations, some of which might have, looking at the world through particular lenses, like the lens of women or queers, or increasingly even ability. But one of the, to get us back to one of the themes of this talk between us is intersectionality. I think the real difference that I'm so encouraged by as opposed to kind of siloing these identities and their potential spatial consequences in sort of siloed buckets, okay, which is, I think, was the tendency when at least I started. I think now they're looking at them in a very, imbricated, intertwined way, so that, so that, Mario, the issues you pointed out, that one could see that to think about the environment, right, to think about class, to think about wealth, right, sustainability, building performance even, it means that you have to begin to think about, again, non-compliant bodies as they, go across race, gender, faith, ability, so forth and so on. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that one only has to look at the, at the pandemic, for example, and begin to see what populations were the most vulnerable, and where are those populations located. So, looking at maps of New York City or of any city, you see that the populations who are most vulnerable are the populations that not only had to travel the furthest to work, but the populations that were perhaps more impoverished, the populations that were, let's say, underserved, and that these disproportionately affected not only people of color, but also women. So, so we have here then the intersection of health, of urban design, of infrastructure, of a number of things. And I think we could do the same in terms of thinking about climate and thinking, the climate catastrophe, who is that mostly affecting?
Exactly.
We have I think we've perhaps covered this a little bit in our answer to Mark's question, but this is a question from Evangelos Katsiaris. Thank you both for the conversation. Thankfully, many of the issues discussed today are essential concerns to current architecture students and educators. How would you describe the past 25 years in that respect? What has changed and what still needs to be done? Joe, I don't know if you want to say any more about that, as you are writing to a younger generation in your memoir.
Yeah. Well, I think we maybe answered that question. I mean, in that I think both of us have seen a kind of shift to this kind of integrated intersectional thinking that's looking more expansively at those issues. But I would say that while, Mario, you're giving me a lot of credit in, my work, I look to your work, I look to Mabel Wilson's work, again, supportive friends, colleagues, the amazing show that you were just in that Mabel curated. I know that the League did a event around reconstructions at MoMA. And so, but I guess what I mean to say is that while I think that, let's say, my generation and then your generation and then generations beneath us, I think it's really the younger folk that are really doing the interesting work. Some of it I think we know about, others we don't. And I'm eager to hear more about everyone out there and others who are we should become more aware of. Okay. But it's the future is the new generation who are doing the heavy lifting.
And here's perhaps also a question about the future. And this is from Sirban Steen. What design problems are you looking forward to next after the restroom as opportunities to explore and question our gendered assumptions in architecture?
Well, that's a great question. And so, mixed design without being sort of self-promotional. So, we're a think tank, and then we also work with clients to actually try to create, more inclusive environments. And so some examples are we've been doing, we have and now continue to do a lot of work with universities. I'm really, really, really excited about a project that we're working on in conjunction with two other architects, POW architects with the new dean, Vishan Chakrabarty at Berkeley, and Hanbury Architects. And it's a ground up residential college at Princeton University. It used to be called Wilson College, and the name has been changed, Hobson College, to commemorate the donor who happened, Melody Hobson, who is a Black alum of Princeton. And I think that a big motivator of our work, not I think, I know, is again, Princeton's, they call it their value proposition, which is to make sure that this new college is intersectionally inclusive. And also, I think Rosalie pointed out another project we're working on, the Mixed Museum Project, and we're really excited. We're working with the Queens Museum as a partner and the Architecture League, as it were, who's been and continues to be a big supporter of us, who's helped us get grants from the NISCA and the NEA. And the idea is to do 2 years of engagement with one of the most diverse local communities in the world, Queens, with the goal of coming up with some sort of high-level principles and design ideas to make that museum space as a case study, again, better meet the needs of its diverse community. So the short answer is, and lastly, I'd say maybe the most exciting thing for us is we've reached out to Yale Public Health and to friends like Aaron Friedlander and Magna Mostafa, autism specialist clinicians at CHOP, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And we're also really now rolling up our sleeves and looking at spaces like clinics and hospitals. So yeah, thanks for that question.
And here's a question from Edson Kabelfin. Thank you for a great discussion. Aaron Betsky's Queer Space was also published around that time in 1997. Both of your works for me are influential as a young queer scholar and architect. How do you see your work, Stud, converging or diverging from Betsky's work?
Okay. What was the name of the person who asked that question?
Edson.
Edson. Hi, Edson. Thank you for that question. I'll try to answer it briefly. First of all, I'm glad you brought up and credited and did what I neglected to do, is give also credit to other, pioneers, and that one of whom was Aaron Betsky, like Mark Robbins, who's also here. And I would say this: Aaron's work is extremely important, but I'd say it differs from my work or our work, and that I think Aaron was interrogating queer space, studying queer spaces. Either building types that fostered queer community, or if not more importantly, I think queer designers who were not being given credit at their time. And so I feel like Stud sort of complements that work, but it's a shift in focus. So we were less interested in interrogating spaces by and for queers, okay, but instead we're thinking of queer as a lens, that queer was a kind of outsider perspective that allowed us to sort of interrogate and call into question in a very critical way mainstream space. Again, mainstream, let's say, white masculine space, okay, as a vehicle to kind of understand how we came to where we were at that time, and as a vehicle to think critically and challenge those conventions. Okay, so I hope that answers that. I think Betsky's book was more about focusing on queer contributions and queer spaces, ours as an outsider lens. And I just want to say that I'm still very proud of that perspective, because I think, and Mario, I think it gets back to the work that you and your colleagues are doing. Again, this notion of encounter that often race or gender is a kind of perspective, a critical perspective, an analytical perspective that really allows us to understand the insidious ways in which discourses like ours perpetuate, again, heteronormativity, racism, and ableism.
Yeah, and so that might actually be a good time to introduce this. Was a question from my sister, my co-conspirator, Mabel Wilson.
Hi, Mabel.
And Mabel asked, rather than separate, which was certainly in the early work of the 1990s, can you say more about how whiteness and patriarchy work in concert in architectural discourse to facilitate how power is represented as well as wielded? So I'll let you start with that one,
No,
Joe.
Mario, I'm going to let you start. I've talked too much.
Okay. Well, I think, in looking at that Badlands photograph again, which actually one of the attendees, Marianne Case, maybe it wasn't Marianne Case, but one of the other attendees reminded us that Badlands was in the West Village, at the meatpacking district. But in any case, that image, as I mentioned, was not only, and I think here, in terms of talking about the limitations of stud, we're not only talking about the binary of masculine versus feminine, but also that, the default of whiteness, that we're talking about the sort of white male and white male body, and that image, I think, sort of resonates there. And I think that, for me, it also comes back to the history of architecture going back to Vitruvius, in that, it is the white male, white able-bodied male that is inscribed in architecture in terms of its, beginning architectural theory. And that is the Vitruvian 10 books on architecture, in which he describes how this perfectly symmetrical body, as this metaphor for architecture. And so, I think the question here as we're having this discussion is not only, let's say, dismantling the binary of masculine versus feminine, but it's also dismantling that privileged position, of white male subjectivity. So how do we decenter, if you will, whiteness, not only decenter the masculine, but also decenter the whiteness of the masculine, within architectural discourse and within sort of framing architecture.
Right. And just, to build on what you're saying, Mario, I think that you gave the example of Vitruvius and then Leonardo's man, Vitruvian man, but then also, modernism, these tropes are so pervasive, right? These homophobic and transphobic and racially and racist tropes are made manifest. Think of the Modular Man by Le Corbusier. I mean, again, wonderful architecture, but it's inscribed within the whole history of our discourse. And, again, this notion that the default user that we assume is, again, a kind of white, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual man. And so I just also want to turn back to you, Mabel. I can't see you, right? But I think it's your work, again, like the show that you just curated at MoMA, that really is looking at the way in which, right, paternalistic, racist, right, and problematic sort of gendered assumptions are encoded in the different spaces that the people you brought to your to your show, including Mario, okay, whose piece I loved, okay, is all about both revealing, but again, I just want to say that for me, what was so great about your show and about your work and about Mario's work and the work of some of my colleagues is the way it simultaneously unpacks these ugly histories, forces us to reckon, be accountable, but again, doesn't just dwell on the past, but forces us, you forced us to think again about alternative futures. And I think that for me, your show your agenda and the work of Mario and others, I think is a role model for us to think about moving forward.
I know we're almost out of time. We do have a couple of other questions. So if you don't mind, Joel, I'd like to also, I think we can spend maybe 5 or so more minutes and answer these questions. Let's see, this is a question from Nico Palotto. I'm extremely thankful for all your work, Mario and Joel, and this presentation was great. It makes me revisit my own MArch architectural thesis, where through built form, which probed queer space, bodies, and spaces they inhabit as part of their community. I'm very interested in connecting as a fellow gay designer. Have you read Michel Foucault, Heterotopias of Other Spaces, and did this influence any of your thoughts or research to date in relation to architecture, activism, or other aspects of bodies in space? My direct answer to that is absolutely yes. It is on my syllabus every semester, and it is, of course, quite I would say, a dense essay. So for so for students and young designers, and even for myself, read it multiple times. But I think, what Foucault does is, situate and gets us to really rethink space in terms of power, knowledge, and these relationships of of power and what that means, in terms of applying that to architecture, and how does architecture spatialize and contextualizes these conditions.
Yeah. And I would just again agree. The answer is yes, 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 and yes. If you were to say to me, Joel, who was the primary influencer on your work since I began as a student, and it was actually Tony Vidler, my teacher, who introduced me to the work of Foucault. It's Foucault, okay, and I think, as Mario pointed out, I think it's Foucault who not only showed us the way in which he said different discourses and disciplines, like reproduce power in the most innocent everyday places of our life, like law, television. Well, he wasn't looking at television, but everyday discourses. But I think, Mario, as you point out, that he really spatialized those, right, in his analysis of the prison, the panopticon. And also, I'd say one thing that was really important to me from Foucault and my colleagues is to sort of focus on vision and the gaze, right? The way in which architecture in spaces like prisons, but could be museums or schools, facilitate a way of looking that subtly but no less powerfully reinforces power relationships and often gender relationships. And that was central, that Foucauldian idea, to STUD and to everything I do today, and I think so many other people do as well. Yeah. In fact, Mario, your project at MoMA again, that I keep on referring to, was a kind of vision machine, right? Would you say that it was a kind of post-Foucauldian apparatus?
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of multi-dimensional, multimedia, if you will, performance and vision and protest machine. Absolutely. Maybe 2 more questions. This one, this is actually from your colleague, Seb.
Hi, Seb.
Seb writes, with it being Pride Month, what are the dual potentials and risks of sanction well-funded queer spaces? I think of metropolitan queer districts and projects like the Pulse, Nightclub Memorial, etc.
Mario, I'm going to let you handle that one.
I wanted you to see what you had to say to Seb about these sanctioned spaces, because I know that you've also been involved with the planning for the national LGBTQ+A museum. Is that right, Joel?
Well, yeah, we were just part of a team, just one member of a team that was hired by a group that wants to start an LGBTQ plus museum in New York. And I hope that moves forward. Yeah. But my answer to that is that you know I think that these well-funded, well-sanctioned queer spaces, the good part is that maybe they help us to commemorate and not forget, a history that risks being disremembered or vanished. And I think it gets back to that idea of historical or reckoning as a form of agency moving forward. But I think that or I think maybe what you're implying, Seb, you're not here because I know you so well, is that it risks, I think, again, maybe broadcasting the voices of those who are usually heard in this discourse, which again is potentially, white, privileged, in this case, gay men. But again, I'm not casting aspersions. I don't know enough about the Pulse Memorial, but I think there's that tendency. I don't know, Mario, what you would say to that.
Yeah, I think that the last part of your response in terms of thinking about the risk and in terms of whose voice, right, gets amplified and whose voice and which voices are marginalized, that perhaps that's at the root of the question here. And I think we have to be conscious and make sure that we are being as inclusive within our own community as possible. And that's where I'm optimistic, because I do think that the younger generation are holding the feet to the fire of the older generation to do that. Maybe we'll just take this last question here from BZ Zhang. Thank you so much. There's absolutely so much amazing work, especially led from queer students and activists, but there's still so much queerphobia, transphobia, ableism, racism, sexism, et cetera, within the conventional practice. Even if we do our best as queer designers to apply queer lenses and make space for ourselves. I hear all the time from young designers about misgendering, discrimination, and so forth at schools and firms. I'd love to hear how you might imagine queer futures for the literal practice of making queer space beyond conventional practice. What does the future queer architectural practice look and feel like? I think this is really a fantastic question to end on, and so I'll let you have the last word on that, Joel.
No, I need to think. So how about you? Do you have any first thoughts about that one?
Thanks so much for this question. I mean, I think that it really, I will say that, when I was, a student, and I hate to sound like one of those, older people, but I do not ever recall there being this kind of public conversation that we're having today. And perhaps that was because, books like Mark's book and Aaron's book and Joel's book, they weren't out yet. But that we are having this conversation, I think, shows that within the discipline and within the academy, I think we've come, quite a distance. Also in terms of visibility, as Joel and I are both, practitioners and academics. And I think that visibility is extremely important. And that the more of us who are visible, the better that we can make it for others who are coming, following in our footsteps.
Yeah. And I would just add to that I think it's about who does the work and where we're doing the work. And so I think what's important is forming, I would say, intergenerational alliances that bridges like old folk like me and young folk. I'm presuming you're young out there, maybe not. But intergenerational and intersectional alliances that make sure, you know, Mario, what you said before, that there are many, many voices at the table, not limited to trans, queer, non-binary folk, okay? But also, again, people of different races, abilities, and faiths. So I think that's critical. And I think it's also where we do that work. Okay, and we need a lot of people to do this work because there are a lot of places. And I think it begins in the academy and calling into question the canon, the curriculum, right? As well as the kind of protocols of professional practice. And I see Rosalie, and I would say that I know that the Architecture League, I know that, you know, firsthand that this is some of the work that you're beginning to do. You know, in other words, that another vehicle is institutions like yours that are imagining alternative futures.
So I came back on because it's time for us to close up. But I just wanted to say, when Mario read that last question, he left out, I think, out of modesty, a phrase, "You are both icons," and of course you both are. You're both amazing people, and this conversation and the density of ideas and the observations and kind of future directions sparking out of this has been fantastic. So it's a conversation that we really look forward to continuing in the fall, I hope. And I just want to thank everybody for coming, and most of all, thank the two of you for doing this. And thanks. So bye, everybody.
Thank you. Have a nice day, everyone.
Yes, you too. Bye.
Bye.